Welcome to Left of the Law. In today's episode, I'll be looking at the ways in which the UK government can reduce wealth inequality. Wealth inequality is a massive phenomenon that people have been speaking about, but a lot of people don't actually know what wealth inequality is. Now, in order to understand what wealth inequality is, it's important to understand what wealth is. So, taken from the Oxford Dictionary, wealth is essentially large amounts of money, property, and assets that a person or a country owns. Inequality essentially is the magnitude or the size of disparity within a certain concept. So in this case, we're talking about wealth inequality, which essentially is the degree to which a certain individual/entity withholds a nation's wealth. So in more simpler terms, how much of the wealth in a country or in a nation is concentrated by a certain demographic, a certain percentage of the country's population. Now, in the UK, wealth inequality has grown massively, especially since COVID-19 recently. And 2020 figures from Office of National Statistics, ONS, suggest that wealth inequality is worsening indeed. And the richest 10% of households hold 43% of wealth, whereas on the other hand, the poorest 50% withhold only 9% of a nation's wealth. So immediately that springs an issue within our current economic system. This isn't to say that wealth is an issue. Wealth in itself is not an issue. However, where the issue does come into play is how much wealth a certain demographic is able to concentrate in contrast to their counterparts at the bottom of the wealth scale. Between 2020 and 2022, which is during COVID periods, billionaire wealth increased by almost £150 billion. Now, this is obviously due to a magnitude of different factors, but two of the main reasons why this has occurred was one, due to the central bank intervening in the economy, and the second reason is due to the government's attempts to offset the impacts of COVID-19. Central bank policy, which is essentially quantitative easing or the manipulation of interest rates, which is under the control of only the central bank, has been very detrimental in increasing wealth inequality. So the central bank essentially prints money artificially, and in order to circulate this money into the economy, in theory, they have to buy or purchase government bonds. The first issue is this liquidates those who currently have possession of government bonds. And the second issue is that as you print more money into the economy, this naturally inflates the economy because the value of your money has essentially reduced, meaning in order for you to buy, let's say, a cucumber or an apple or a pack of eggs, you need more coins, more physical cash in order to obtain these items. But in the conversation of wealth, what happens is assets, which consists of property, land, skyscrapers, and all sorts, those items move up in value. And obviously, when these items move up in value, this means that the wealthy are able to essentially, either cash in on these assets, or they're able to continue to buy more of these assets in hopes that in hopes that the central bank in future will continue with the quantitative easing programs. Now, from 2008 to around 2013, there were a lot of quantitative easing programs taking place by the central bank. This was, of course, to offset initially the impacts of the financial crisis from 2007 to 2008. 3.9 children are currently living in poverty. 6.7 million households can't afford to heat their homes. The case to reduce wealth inequality hasn't been any stronger than it currently is. Now, the first solution to this problem, I will have two solutions. But the first solution that I'll propose to you all is the idea of a one-time wealth tax. Now, academics have suggested that it's perhaps more beneficial to have a one-time wealth tax over a consistent wealth tax that happens over a series of months or years. The reasoning behind this is because the wealthy are very, very efficient at avoiding tax, And especially with the fact that this isn't income, so it's definitely going to be much harder to tax. Wealth is really, really, really difficult to quantify when it comes to trying to extract money from it. Academics also suggest that perhaps a consistent wealth tax may drive those at the top of the economy out, and it could, cause them to diversify, or it could cause them to essentially leave the UK and operate elsewhere. Now, in a report written by the LSE, the London School of Economics, 3 of their academics have looked into the possibility of a wealth tax, and they've stringently looked into how much it will generate, how much this will cost the government to implement, and how effective and efficient this will be. The only thing that they don't discuss in this report, this 10-page report, is how and the way in which this money will be distributed. So on the screen right now is a table of estimates of the one-off tax, and I know there are a lot of figures, and a lot of us don't like using figures or just looking at a lot of numbers on a sheet or on a screen. But in actuality, this is really, really simple. So in general, when it comes to taxation, there are 2 types of taxes. So there are progressive taxes and regressive taxes, and flat taxes are generally seen as quite regressive, which it really can be, of course. And progressive taxes, which essentially looks at the percentage of taxable income or taxable wealth in this case, will increase as the value of your assets or the value of your entities increases in value. Now, if we just look at the flat tax table, we can already see a bit of an issue. Now, in order for this to work, not only do the taxes have to be effective, but the taxes also have to be very fair. Now, if the threshold for one individual is £10,000, whilst the threshold for another individual is £250,000, and the annualized rate, which is the percentage of taxable money, is 1% for both individuals, that isn't a fair system. And of course, you would see that we are generating substantially less money once we go higher up the tax bracket. But just in general, it's not really fair to tax someone who has perhaps £10,000 worth of assets the same as you tax £250,000 worth of assets. In general, it's not really effective, and that's why you can see that the flat tax percentage, although it may generate a lot of revenue in terms of in billions, if the threshold was at £250,000, you want to make sure that you aren't hitting ordinary people, or I'd say middle classes, who are just underneath the bracket of millionaire status. You want to make sure that that isn't the case. And if let's say a middle class family has 2 properties or maybe 3 properties, it may not be as effective in taxing them at the same rate as perhaps someone who owns 3 supermarkets and 5 supermarket buildings, or 2 acres of land. It's not really the same, and it wouldn't really be a fair system. So if we look at the progressive tax system, which is at the bottom half of the table, we'd see that the percentage of taxable wealth increases as the threshold increases. That is what you call a progressive tax system, or progressive, in this case, a progressive wealth system. Now, someone who has assets, or who meets the threshold of £10 million isn't paying the same rate of tax as someone who meets the threshold by just £1 million, or let's say £250,000. It's different. So a 1 million threshold rate would equate to a 0.8% tax. And then on the other hand, you've got a £10 million threshold, which would equate to a 3% annualized rate of tax. Now, both of these systems, the flat tax and the progressive taxes, will raise £250 billion. But logically speaking, it would make sense for there to be a progressive system, as this would be really, really effective, and it would not be a disincentive for one to generate or attempt to generate wealth. Now, again, I reiterate this point. This is a one-time tax, and the reason it's a one-time tax is in order to prevent massive wealth accumulation during periods of economic hardship, so during recessions and so forth. This shouldn't be, as I understand, or as the LSE academics in this article understand, that this shouldn't be a consistent occurrence in the economy. I think it would be really, really effective if this was instead a one-time system. Of course, we don't have a wealth tax in the UK, such as this one here, but if it was to be implemented, it would be really effective in generating a lot of wealth. And what this would do is, instead of the governments or our previous governments in the past, or for instance David Cameron, George Osborne's government, instead of them resorting to austerity policies, they could actually implement something of this nature. But of course it's unlikely, because at the end of the day this is a conservative government, and they do have the people within their party. You know, most of the party funding is raised by billionaires, so they have to keep them on the right side of the books. Perhaps the Labour Party could slide this in. It's unlikely, considering the direction that the Labour Party is currently going in, but this would be a traditional Labour idea, especially a socialist ideal. Now, the second solution is arguably my favourite solution out of the two, and this is really, really different to the tax alternative. This is actually introduced, or proposed rather, by Gary Stevenson, who was an ex-city trader turned inequality economist. So he has a YouTube channel called Gary's Economics, in which he outlines the current prospects of the future prospects of our economy and the current state we're in terms of inequality and in terms of wealth accumulation and so forth. Really, really great channel. I'd highly recommend it. He proposes a wealth time limit. So in essence, this is a limit on how long one can keep his or her assets. Currently, our system has inheritance, which is essentially the passing down of assets from one generation to another generation. And this actually perpetuates and continues the cycle of wealth inequality, and it doesn't actually contribute in reducing it at all. So reading from wealtheconomics.org, Gary writes that the problem can actually be solved quite neatly and easily, allowing but subtly forcing the descendants of the very wealthy to spend their wealth over the long term without any resort to taxation. We could simply place a limit on the physical property the same way we place a limit on intellectual property. As a society, we place time limits on copyrights and patents because we don't think it's fair to allow people who invent works of art or ideas to maintain complete economic control of them forever, long after they are dead. If you write a song or a book, you own it for, depending on the country, around 100 years. If you invent a new drug or machine, the patent, again, depending on the country, lasts only 20 years. Now, this wealth time limit could be really, really effective if implemented. So not only does this divert away from your traditional way of sucking money from those at the top or in general working people, instead we have a time limit which intrinsically forces those at the top to spend in the economy rather than hoarding massive amounts of wealth. Economically, the liquidating of assets has a much greater social benefit to the rest of the economy rather than a small few being able to hoard and to accumulate wealth continually. Now, further down Gary's article, he writes that assume that at present 80% of all wealth will be passed to far future generations based on inheritance. Under this new proposed system, that would reduce to 0%. That means all physical property would reach future generations based on their earnings. Each generation would therefore be able to afford 100% of the properties based on their earnings, rather than the current rate of 20%. That means that wages will be able to buy 5 times as many houses as they are able to do. Relative to houses, wages will increase by 400%. Now, I think an important thing to consider is the way in which these finances will then be distributed within the economy. So if you look at the wealth tax, the one-time wealth tax, it would generate a lot of money. Now, how we as a society can massively benefit from this is during periods of hardship, during periods where our public services are crippled. This is where we see lack of efficiency from our public services. So from the NHS at the moment, we've seen massive amounts of waiting lists, and that's due to COVID and also due to previous years of lack of funding for this specific industry. We also saw a massive disparity between private school and state school activity during lockdown. Those at the bottom of the private school system weren't able to, sufficiently or actively enhance their education due to a lack of finance or lack of financial aid during their periods of education. People weren't able to access online learning due to not having internet connections, due to not having the best forms of technology, for instance, an iPad or a laptop to supplement their education. This really, really disproportionately affects those within the state sector and those who are really, really, even those who are recipients of free school meals, for instance, those who really, really rely on, the social aspect of school and being able to have access to free education. It was really, really difficult for some students, and I think that's where we see a massive disparity during crises like the financial crash, during the crises like COVID-19. Now, Gary's alternative, I think, is a more practical approach and is definitely more suited to our modern system. So, the allocation of assets to working people is something that a lot of people are really, really fond of. People aren't able to essentially buy their own homes. Putting down deposits for a first-time home nowadays is really difficult. You need a lot of money to do that. In some cases, it's not really possible as an individual with a single person's wage. By granting ownership of assets across a much greater proportion of the country, we will see the value of houses substantially fall, of course, but with this happening, this would mean that more and more people would be able to get themselves on the housing ladder. And, naturally or traditionally, if you own your own home, there are many, many benefits of doing so as opposed to renting. The idea of being able to create wealth for all is something that not only Gary Stevenson advocates, but it's something that, democratic socialists really, really stand for. And I think that's something that has really been lost within the fabrics of the Labour Party as of today. And it really, really needs to be resurged come the next 2024 general election, if it's then. Now, these principles of essentially everyone able to accumulate wealth really goes against the capitalist doctrine. So the capitalist doctrine banks on the idea that only a select few or a select majority will be able to prosper off of the backs of hard-working people. Now, free market systems really stress on the importance of meritocracy. Now, we live in a Western capitalist society that hasn't really been, something that we can all benefit from. There hasn't really been any evidence that we live in a meritocratic society. You can get a degree, you can go to university, you can graduate from university, you can land a great job, for instance, a £50,000 paying job, but you're still not able to have the physical or the economic benefits that perhaps someone who has a rich family and also has the same degree as you and also has the same paying job, because that person is able, or that family, is able to transfer wealth to the same person that's in your situation, and you're already at a disadvantage economically and in every aspect. So that system of meritocracy doesn't exist. Meritocracy is a false ideology. It doesn't really exist in our current system. Now, it can exist, of course, if we have a reformed economic system, if we have a political system that works for everyone and not for the few. But as it stands, we don't have a functioning meritocratic system. And that brings me to the end of the video. If you did enjoy, please be sure to leave a like and subscribe as always. And like I always say in all of my videos, please spark conversations in the comment section. It really, really encourages people to comment, and it encourages the demand for political discussion in the comment section or elsewhere. My social media channels and links will be in the description down below, so please be sure to check them out, and I'll see you guys in the next video.